Bugün önemli güne hoş geldiniz. Bizim için önemli bir gündü. Ana dilimizi qeyd edirik. Ana dilimiz hakkında çıxış etmək üçün çox değerli bir qonağımız var. Onun dilçidir, dilləri araşdırır. Onunla ilk tanışdığım 2017-18-ci illərə gəlib çıxdı və Azərbaycan dilini bilmədikdə
I'm sure from your own family backgrounds, again, you might have some kind of familiar stories of, maybe your great-grandma or your grandma or whatever is from the same village, and maybe she's familiar with other people who speak different languages who live not far from her. In Jaw, for example, you have, this is mostly an Alfa-speaking community, but there's also in these lots of Danish Azerbaijani Turks. There's what people call ethnic Azerbaijani people, and also what do you think sounds Turkish? What do you think sounds Azerbaijani Turkey? If I say many
Salam, hörmətli xanımlar və cənablar. Bugün önemli güne hoş geldiniz. Bizim için önemli bir gündü. Ana dilimizi qeyd edirik. Ana dilimiz hakkında çıxış etmək üçün çox değerli bir qonağımız var. Onu təqdim etmədən öncə onu bildirmək istəyirəm ki, biz öz dilimizdə, ana dilimizdə danışmasaq, o deməkdir ki, biz bir xalq olaraq yoxa çıxa bilərik və misal üçün Azərbaycanda bunun üçün heç bir problem yoxdur, düzdür. Rusiyanın təsiri var, lakin indi təbliğat gedir və Azərbaycan dilinin möhkəmlənməsi üçün çalışılır. Lakin Cənubi Azərbaycanda onların bu şansları yoxdur. Yəni onlara məcbur fars dilində danışmalıdırlar, Azərbaycan dilini gizlin evdə öyrənməlidirlər və bunun üçün onlara təşəkkür eləmək istəyirəm ki, baxmayaraq, bu qədər çətinliklərin olmasına baxmayaraq, onlar yenə də Azərbaycan dilini yaşadırlar və onu önəmsəyirlər. Və sizə bugün qonağımızı təqdim etmək istəyirəm. Qonağımız UCSD instruktor olaraq çalışır. Zaslansky, əgər səhv tələffüz elədimsə soyadını mənə bildirsin. Mükəmməl. Və Mət dilçidir, dilləri araşdırır. Onunla ilk tanışlığım 2017-18-ci illərə gəlib çıxır və Azərbaycan dilini möhkəmləndirmək üçün gəlmişdi. Dillər Universitetində oxuyurdu və mən də həmin proqramda koordinator olaraq çalışırdım. Lakin Mətin ilk Azərbaycana səfəri 2012-ci ildə olub və Azərbaycanı çox bəyənib, dili çox xoşlayıb və öz sahəsi olaraqdan Qafqaz dillərini seçib. Və buna görə də o həm də Gürcüstanda da yaşayıb, Gürcüstanda səfər edib, Gürcü dilini də biraz bilir, İbrit dilində biraz bilir, Türk dilində bilir, Rus dilində bilir və çox da belə onun haqqında danışmaq olar. Lakin istərdim ki, o Azərbaycan dili haqqında özü bu dili araşdıran və bunun üçün öz ömrünə həsr edən insan kimi davam eləsin və danışsın. Təşəkkürlər Mət gəldiyin üçün.
Teşekkürler. Okey, ben dedim ki ben qadın olarak İngiliz dilinde danışacağım. Ümid ederim ki her şey başa düşer. Ben dilçi kimi gəlirəm, çünkü ben məlumat paylaşmak istəyirəm. Ben sadece aydınlık için her şey İngiliz dilinde paylaşım. Ama ben ümid varım ki bu çıxış ancak akademik bir şey olmasın. Ben daha bir interaktif söhbət istəyirəm sizinlə. Bir çox şeyler haqqında siz bilərsiniz məndən yaxşı, yani öz mədəniyyətinizdir. Ama dilçi perspektivi göstermek için ben başlayayım İngiliz dilində. Ben Multilingualism for an Azerbaijani Diaspora hakkında danışacağım. Bu ne demektir? Bu demektir ki İngiliz diline çevrimindir. We can contextualize what it means to be a diaspora community. I'm son of immigrants myself. So that means different things in Azerbaijan, in Iran, in America. And I think it's worth exploring that question on International Mother Language Day, really to think about how you can conserve and preserve a language across generations when you're in a new community. So we'll explore a little bit about what that means, but I do want to start with that interactive bit to start with. I want to ask the people in the room, how many languages do you think there are in the world? Does anyone actually know the answer to this? Yeah. 20,000. That's a little lower. Close. Close. Yeah, pretty much on the dot, actually. You guys narrowed it down pretty quickly. There's around 6,900. And how you count this can be a little bit different. For example, if I count Southern Azerbaijani, Northern Azerbaijani, one language, two language, most people will say it's one language, but there are some linguists who maybe will say, no, there's two variants. So yes, a hand in the back.
You mean language, not dialects, right?
Yeah,
That's the thing. So dilçi olarak diyeyim, the difference between a dialect and a language is very often political. And the job of a linguist is sometimes to try to step away from politics and try to really think, okay, what are the boundaries of the language? And so as much as possible, we do not look at the political distinctions between dialects, and we often try to look at just the grammar. But for example, if you go to China, is anyone here to study Chinese? No. So if you talk to a Chinese teacher, they will tell you China has a lot of dialects. The language you will learn in a Chinese class is Mandarin Chinese. It's the official language. If you go to Hong Kong, the language there is different. It's official still, but it's not Mandarin, it's Cantonese. And they will say that they are two dialects of Chinese, but they can't understand each other. If you go to Istanbul, I'm sure that you will understand a lot of the Turkish. But if someone from Hong Kong goes to Beijing and speaks in Cantonese, they will not be understood. So what we call a dialect and what we call a language is very often difficult to try to put the precise answer on. The number here comes from Ethnologue. It's an official source created by linguists like me, many of whom who have much more experience than me in trying to count languages of the world. Around 347 languages in the world have over 1 million speakers. These are the big languages, right? Note that Azerbaijani, would be one of those big languages. The remaining majority of the languages in the world, that's to say 95% of them, are spoken by less than 1 million people. That's less than 6% of the world's population. And of these, around 497 of those languages are what we would call nearly extinct. We're going to be talking about language health, language endangerment, what that means today a little bit. So these languages that are nearly extinct, what that means is that they almost have no speakers left. And most of the remaining languages are endangered to different degrees. They have more speakers, so they're not totally near extinction, but they may be endangered in some way. The median size, rather, of most languages in the world is around 3,000 people. So for those of you who maybe have family, or maybe you yourselves are from rural backgrounds, if you go to villages in Iran or Azerbaijan, very often those villages are around this size. And so there are some villages that you may have been to that will actually have their own language. That's quite typical around the world, actually. So I'm asking you to trust me on this because I'm a linguist. I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. I'm not Azerbaijani. I'm American. I come from Irish and Jewish background, so my family is mixed. I'm from New York. But I've been working in Azerbaijan, Georgia, Uzbekistan for over a decade. I mostly work actually with sign languages now. So I work with deaf communities in Baku, Tbilisi. Here I'm using some Georgian Sign Language and explaining about Georgia. But I also have work in rural communities in Azerbaijan, and including actually somewhere near where Punu is from, so in Zaqatala, north of Azerbaijan. When we talk about languages, when we talk about diversity, it's not equal. The spread of languages represented here in this diagram shows you that some languages are much bigger than others. Hopefully you got that idea already when I showed you the numbers, but if you just look at this distribution of populations, some languages like Chinese are much more prominent in the world than smaller languages like French, for example. But all of the languages that are visible here, Vietnamese, French, Bengali, Spanish, Arabic, these are the biggest languages. Yeah.
Turkish one, like, is that Turkey's Turkish? Or
Yes. This is Turkish. This is Republican Turkish from Turkey. Yeah. Sometimes in the 70 million for Turkish normally refers to just from the Republic. Sometimes people will count, okay, there's like Turkmen in Iraq, we will call them Turkish, but usually this number is just from Turkey. Yeah. The point here is, though, again, many of you probably have knowledge of languages that are not going to be in the biggest ones. I hope you understand that that's a valuable kind of knowledge that you guys have. It's worth preserving. I hope to show you. Again, I told you, most languages are spoken by communities of around 3,000 people. So I work with some of those communities in Azerbaijan. This is in a village called Jar that I visited a few times. I have some friends there. Most linguists like me, we don't focus on the big languages around the world. We actually usually focus on these kinds of smaller communities because they are the ones who have less resources and they're in more need of people who work with them to preserve them. So these communities can often be just villages like this. And even in this small area, I hope you can understand there's a lot of diversity. I'm sure from your own family backgrounds, again, you might have some kind of familiar stories of, you know, maybe your great-grandma or your grandma, whatever, is from some village, and maybe she's familiar with other people who speak different languages who would live not far from her. In Jod, for example, you have, this is mostly an Avar-speaking community, but there's also in these blots of beige Azerbaijani Turks, is what we will call ethnic Azerbaijani people. And also there's some Georgian speakers. I don't know if anyone has heard of Ingiloi. It's a language that's used in Azerbaijan also. It's close to Georgian. And then also Sakhor in the pink here. It's another minority community in Azerbaijan. These languages are as different from each other as English and Arabic. They're very different. They do not understand each other. But often Russian or Azerbaijani serves as a kind of, we call it a lingua franca, kind of like how English is a lingua franca here in America. It serves as a kind of bridge across communities. And again, to show you, most of the diversity in the world is not equal. I hope you can see that Iran and Azerbaijan are actually quite big on this map. And if you compare them to places like America, America looks quite shrunk here. This is to reflect the size of speakers of different languages that are native to these areas. So Azerbaijan is actually quite diverse. If you look at how small Korea is, you can't even see it on the map because Korea does not have the kind of diversity that Iran or Azerbaijan have. The most diversity, does anyone know what has the most diversity on the planet? Close? It's actually the biggest one here is Papua New Guinea. And if you look at a real map, Papua New Guinea is so small you can't even see it. It's really small. It's one of the smallest countries. But it has around 1,100 or so different languages that are spoken in it because most of the country is very rural. So there's lots of villages that are in mountains. And so lots of linguists from America, from Russia, from Azerbaijan, from everywhere, they all go fly to Papua New Guinea and work there. I don't. I fly to Azerbaijan. It's still pretty big, right? But it's just, you know, I like Azerbaijani food more than I like Papua New Guinea. Okay, so what do we mean when we talk about Azerbaijani? I've talked about other languages. What about Azerbaijani? I had a question earlier about dialect and language. So from the perspective of a linguist or a Turkologist, it gets messy, partially because of how you guys talk about yourselves. You hear people talk about Azerbaijani, Turki, Azeri Turkish. I'm sure you guys have all heard these terms. I'm sure there's probably some also here that are missing. But the term Azerbaijani for the language, that's something more recent. That's something that came really popular in the 1970s, 1980s, when the Republic got more active in language policy. And the traditional name, just Turki, is what you'll find in like the historical kind of literature very often. The roots of what we call Azerbaijani, that goes back to around 12th century. It's the old Anatolian Turkish language. You will sometimes hear some kind of nationalist, milliyetçi writers who will say, oh no, it's older, it goes back to 9th century, 6th century because of Old Turkic. There are some grammatical features that we focus on that distinguish modern Azerbaijani from Turkish, yeah? So when we think of the language, we think of these kinds of grammatical kinds of things that are probably boring for you, but interesting for, you know, linguists. I'm going to defer to some experts on this. This is Tanrı Verdi. He's an expert historical linguist, and he usually puts it at around 14th, 13th century for origins of modern Azerbaijani. When we look at the language, it actually comes as a literary language. Most people today don't necessarily think of it as being a literary rooted language because the script has been changed many times, as you are all aware. But there are certain kinds of features that are different from Turkish, like when we look at Fuzuli, for example, and he says, this ub thing, harolubam, is something you don't see in Turkish at all. It actually, I think, sounds a little bit weird in Azerbaijani today. How do you guys feel about harolubam? So, I mean, I don't know. Most people, I think, would not say it this way. This is kind of very poetic, but especially olubam sounds not great, yeah? But I actually have some background in looking at this in my own work. I've looked at Azerbaijani literature quite a bit. When you think of Azerbaijani literature, Fuzuli is one of the people that you will think of first. This kind of form of the verb for like yazmak. You can say yazmışam, men yazmışam, biz yazmışıq, sen yazmışsan veya yazıpsan, bazı gelen yazıpsan dersen. Okay, so some people will say yazıpsan, some people will say yazmışsan. You can also get yazmıştır, yazıptır, yazıp, yazmışlar, yazıplar. Sen dersen yazmıştırlar yoksa. So there's some variation in Azerbaijani. We actually look to this variation as an indicator of what separates it from Turkish. In Turkish, you don't have this, right? So very often when people hear the dir, for example, a lot of Turkish speakers will identify, oh, that sounds very Azerbaijani, right? This is something we see, though, in Fuzuli, and we see it in other writers. One of the first writers in Azerbaijani is a guy named Kishvari. He just wrote some novels, so most people don't know too much about him, but he's a late 14th century, early 15th century writer. People think of Khatay, people think of Fuzuli, Mullah Van Gif, also Akhundzadeh, probably for some people in the room, if you're familiar with him, and also Shirvani. These are some of the classic writers of Azerbaijani literature, and when we look at them, we see the same variation that I'm talking to you about. So I just want to get your ideas. What do you think sounds Turkish? What do you think sounds Azerbaijani, Turkey? If I say men yazmışam, how's that sound?
Azerbaijan.
Sen yazmışsan. Can yazmış. Okay. Can yazmıştır. Mesela bu. Can yazmıştır olsa biraz daha Azerbaycan diline okşayır. Can yazıb. Can yazıbdır. So you guys have clear intuitions about how you talk differently from Turkish people. It doesn't mean that you're not Turkish. You can still be Azerbaijani, you can be Turkish, you can be both. But the way that you speak has a specific kind of pattern. This is true for all speech communities, for all languages around the world. There are ways that we talk that are different. Sometimes languages can grow apart over time. So Turkish, Azerbaijani, same historical root, but grows apart over time because of this kind of variation. It doesn't mean that one is more correct or that one is incorrect. And sometimes even one language can allow multiple things to be correct. So that's exactly what Azerbaijani does. It treats these multiple variants of like can yazıb, can yazmıştır as correct. Əlbəttə ki, yoxdur, hə? Əvvəllər var imiş amma, eski Anadolu dilində var imiş, indi yoxdur. Çünkü değişir sadece. Bütün diller değişir. So just as a process of language change, Azerbaijani and Turkish grew apart. And I want to say that, even in English, we have some kind of variation, right? You can look at sentences like John kneels before the Queen. Okay, everyone understands, I hope. John kneeled before the Queen, past tense. John knelt before the Queen. These are the same thing. The past tense, there can be multiple variants for some words, yeah? So this variation, it's allowed in English. There's a similar kind of variation that's allowed in Azerbaijani, but not in Turkish. Another question about variation. This is a map that shows variation in America. Does anyone know what it's showing? Without cheating? Yeah, so I want to ask you guys, what do you call a sweet drink? In this room, what do you guys say in English? Someone said juice? Juice? Künün, yeah. Doğrudan juice. Azerbaycan dilində juice desən yaxşı, amma İngilis dilində juice deyirsən. Soda. Would anyone have something besides soda? Coke. You would say Coke.
I might say Coke.
Okay. Where did you learn English? In Azerbaijan. Where was your teacher from? I'm not making fun of them. Okay. See, this is why I don't know. There's some Peace Corps people who maybe come and teach, so I don't know. I'm asking because this kind of variation is real, but it's hard to learn in a classroom. When you come to America, when you go to a different country, when you go to Britain, there's always going to be variation. And so if you say Coke, usually that actually indicates, I can tell where you are. If you say you want a Coke, I can tell that you're from Texas. Because someone from Texas who is like a rural Texas person, not from Dallas, not from Austin, they will say, I want a Coke, and they can mean like a Sprite, right? You go to a restaurant, you say, I got a Coke, they ask, what kind of Coke? Oh, I want a Sprite. This variation is actually predictable, right? It's been mapped out by linguists. This is part of the work that we do. You might have, again, some intuition that says, oh, one word is right, one word is wrong. In linguistics, we don't do that. We find how people talk and we document it, right? There is actually a similar map in Azerbaijan, not for Iran, but for Azerbaijan Respublikası Özü. There was a linguist called Sheraliyev, a great linguist. I don't know if anyone has heard of him. But when the Soviet Union was still around, Sheraliyev went with a team of linguists and he did something like this for Azerbaijan, and he documented how people talk. Some people in the north say üçün, in the south they might say üçün, some might say gedrem, some might say jedrem, and so on. And this variation was all mapped. It's quite sad actually, because the language is still changing, but we don't have anyone who's mapping this anymore. Sheraliyev has passed away, and there's not a lot of money for this in Azerbaijan now. So if you want to become a linguist, I implore anyone in the room, if you want to look at this, please follow your passion. Take up the mantle of this kind of work. It's important because we need to understand how people talk so that in the future, if we have some kind of, let's say, language model like Siri or, I don't know, Alexa, some kind of technology, we don't want the technology to misunderstand somebody from Texas, right? We want it to understand everybody equally. How about this? What do you guys call this in English? Oh, you guys are all securely water fountain sayers. Okay. This is also a subject of variation. The Harvard Dialect Society mapped this. So water fountain actually fits a more kind of an East Coast pattern, which I think is spreading, to be fair, throughout most of the country. California, most of California, except for some of the urban centers, including in the Bay Area, but also like LA, San Diego, which also say water fountain, they say drinking fountain. And then, I don't know if anyone has heard the term bubbler. It's a traditional term for a water fountain. It comes from around Boston. So again, this is predictable, it's mappable. I really don't know what happened in Wisconsin. I think some people from Boston maybe got bored of Boston and moved out or something. I have no idea what happened. Okay, so again, this variation exists, it's predictable, you can often map these kinds of things. And if we're mapping Azerbaijani and Turkish on a map, we can actually have a cline of variation that goes from Istanbul all the way to Baku to Tabriz and see where these occur. So I did that for literature. I looked at some historical Azerbaijani classics. This is part of what I do as a professional linguist, where I go through and I read all of the classic works and I document how often they are saying Can yazıb, Can gedib, and so on and so on and so on. And that includes some of the authors that I showed you earlier. And when I do that, I actually see that there's changes over time. So in the first person, like, for example, Olubam, Har Olubam, as Fuzuli says, you see that that is actually very rare. In fact, it's so rare that Fuzuli is one of the only people who ever said that. No one else really uses it in the first person. That's why today in Azerbaijan, it's very unusual to hear Gedibem. It would be very strange to hear that. In the second person, Sen Gedibsan, Sen Gelibsan, this is a little bit more common. That's what we see here. This is second person, Sen Gelib, Sen olsa da siz gelipsiniz olabilir. We see that it occurs with ib in the orange, but it's usually used with mush in the second person. It's very still unusual to hear it with ib, even in the modern language. But in the third person, ub is actually the usual kind of preferred pattern. And a lot of this is because if you ever read any kind of newspapers like Ekinci or Az Post or any other kind of official news source from Azerbaijan, they will always use ub instead of mish in the third person. So this pattern actually starts out with Fuzuli and it becomes stronger over time. And mish becomes lower over time. There's a drop in mish. And also in mishdur, it also drops. Yeah. Yeah, well, that's because Akhundov himself started using ub a lot. And after Akhundov, it was used throughout the entirety of the 17th and 18th centuries. But when you get to later authors like Shirvani, for example, he doesn't really ever use Galibsan. He'll always say Gamisan. Gamisis. Yeah. So after Shirvani, in the modern language, it mostly disappears. It becomes kind of non-literary. It's used in like Baku, like Lor Dilda, yani, like a kind of casual speech. Yeah. So the point of showing you this, though, is to show that this is in a way a reflection of how Azerbaijani moves away from Turkish. It's the kind of concretization of this ub thing that Azerbaijanis like to use. Now, when you go to Iran today, when you go to Azerbaijan today, you'll see, of course, there's a situation with multiple languages, as we've talked about before. We call this diglossia, and also with the script, we call that digraphia. Di means two, and so digraphia is two scripts. Anyone know what this building is? Yeah, this is the Russian drama theater in Baku. And if you look here, it says Rus Dram Teatr. And then here in Russian, it says Ruski Dramaticheski Teatr. So this is a perfect example of the kind of diglossia that we see in Baku. You have Russian on one side, Azerbaijani on another side. They are more or less both acting in a sort of state manner as something that you put on official buildings oftentimes. There's been we call it de-Russification, moving away from Russian over time, now that the Republic is independent, but it's still used throughout most of Baku. If I call, for example, an Uber or something in Baku or call like a taxi, half the time the guy will speak to me in Russian because I look like I'm not really from there. Yeah.
Russian.
Of course it is, yes. I picked it because I know that on two sides the writing. Yes, so this is a unique kind of building for that. But still, you can go to Yeni Azerbaijan Partiyası binası mesela. They will have Russian and English there, or English, Azerbaijani there as well. I don't know so much about Tabriz, for example. I have not been to Tabriz. I would imagine that Azerbaijani is probably not written everywhere. I imagine it's mostly Persian. But I imagine still that when you walk around, you probably hear both languages. I mean, would that be accurate? More so Turkish as in Turkey? Okay, yeah, okay. Right, so that's kind of what I would expect. This sort of diglossia is actually pretty stable. That means it doesn't need to change. It can be different for communities in diaspora because then there's a question of which language is taught to children. But when you're growing up in this environment, it's quite natural for people to learn both. People go to Az sector or Rus sector, and sometimes they learn both languages anyway, regardless of which sector they get education in. But the point of showing you this is to talk about prestige. I want to talk about what a prestige language is. Does anyone know what that term means? It's a term we use in linguistics. A prestige, yeah. Kinda, yeah. It's a language that has the most social importance, social capital. So for example, if you want to get a job as a waiter in Baku, you're probably going to get a better paying job if you speak Russian. That's because Russian is a prestige language in Baku. You're also probably going to get better paid than a Russian guy who speaks only Russian if you speak Russian and Azerbaijani, because those kind of waiters can serve both clientele, they can serve the Russian tourists, they can serve the Azerbaijani locals, no problem, right? Or even the Russian locals. So both languages, both Azerbaijani and Russian, are prestige languages in Baku. But if you speak another language, let's say you speak Talish or Lezgian or Avar, some of you may have heard of these other terms. I mentioned Avar earlier. I mentioned Sahur earlier. If you speak one of these languages, you get no extra money. There's no prestige. So those are languages that we would refer to as low prestige, not because they are bad or worse, but because they have less value in terms of the economic viability in the city. In Tabriz, I would imagine that Persian is the primary prestige language. I don't know if you get paid more as a waiter if you speak Azeri Turki. You guys can tell me. You know more than me.
Why everybody knows that
Yeah.
regardless. So
Right.
it's not like it's not a big. I don't think that is the case. Like we can be very, very old and to could have problem with like speaking Farsi, but now.
Right.
Shouldn't get.
Right. So for the older generations, maybe they didn't know Persian
Yeah.
as much, but now they kind of have to, because it is the prestige language in modern Iran, just as English is here in America. Does anyone know what America's official language is? There is none, right? Trick question. Yeah. So we don't have an official language, right? Before Trump. With Trump, now we don't know what will happen. Maybe English will be made official. That is a possibility. But historically, we have not had an official language and we have not needed one because English is already the prestige language. It doesn't need an official status because you already need it everywhere you go. Now, I live in San Diego. I work in San Diego. In San Diego, Spanish is very important. So there is, even though Spanish is lower prestige than English, if I want to get a job, for example, as an Uber driver, it helps me a lot to know Spanish. So Spanish has a prestige of its own in San Diego. But if I know Turkish, that's not going to help me in San Diego. So again, it depends on, we call it your ecosystem. It's the ecosystem of your language. Any questions about that? Comments?
This term. It's so interesting because in my head, prestige, I want to associate it with something that's, like elite, it's good. But for you, it's more what's useful, right?
Well, if something is elite, that is in a certain sense because it's useful. That's the kind of sense that it's used here in linguistics. It doesn't have to be that it's useful. For example, French. French arguably has a certain kind of prestige that is not useful in most of America. That doesn't make it less of a prestige language. For example, if I'm writing an Instagram story and I want to have like a wine bottle and I write something in French, I'll be like, ooh, French. You saw the recent interaction between Macron and Trump where he says it's a very beautiful language. Well, this is because of that kind of stereotype of it as a prestigious language. So it doesn't have to be useful. It usually is.
Going back to your San Diego example, if I need French and Spanish and English in San Diego and I'm driving an Uber, French doesn't really help.
Probably not, yeah. Oh, but if you go up to Vermont, it would, yeah. If you go to Vermont, there's lots of French Canadian immigrants and tourists who don't speak English that well, even though they learn it in school. Okay, I want to talk about language endangerment. Very often, and you guys know more about this than me in many regards, you'll hear about the status of Turkic languages in Iran as being not very high, because they are not prestigious languages in Iran, in the prestige sense that we're talking about here. So we have specific criteria that we use as linguists when we're talking about language endangerment. And I want to talk with you guys about how we assess things. This is my job to assess it, but maybe you are better suited to actually make a comment on that assessment for your own community. So one thing we use is what we call intergenerational criteria. Intergeneration means across generations, from grandma to son or daughter to their own children. If a language is used by everybody, all ages, we call it safe. So English is safe. Azerbaijani in Azerbaijan, not always safe actually, because there are some children, for example, who are, again, Rus sector. You can send your children to a Russian language school, and maybe some of them will not always learn Azerbaijani. That would be kind of rare. Most of them do learn Azerbaijani now very fluently, especially because when you go to like university, you usually are using Azerbaijani as a language of education. But Azerbaijani, I would say mostly is around 5 or 4 in Azerbaijan. It could be the case that in Iran, it would be lower. And it could be the case that here in America, for some of you, it might be even lower. So that's something to think about going forward. The way something is in your home country may be very different here. And it's worth thinking about how you want to address that, if you want to or not. When we get to the more unsafe degrees of endangerment, we're looking at, for example, situations where you can have a language that is used by the parents' generation, but not older. I told you a little bit about my background. I'm from New York. Both my grandmothers spoke languages that were not English, but my mom and my dad only spoke English. So for my languages, I would actually be in the second level, severely endangered. These are languages that are used mostly by the grandparents' generation. Does anyone remember what my family background is?
Jewish.
Irish and Jewish. What do you think my languages are? Irish. Irlandi dili. So in Ireland, we actually speak 2 languages. We speak English and Irish. My grandmother spoke a bit of Irish. My mom speaks no Irish. So Irish actually is an endangered language. Even today, you go to Ireland, you learn you learn Irish in the schools because you have to. Most people actually don't speak it that well. Yeah.
But this concept of language, is it inherited by country?
No, it's by speech community. And remember, the speech community doesn't have to be your country. It could be as small as a village. So I remember earlier I said I work in a village called Jar sometimes. In Jar, everybody speaks Avar. Everybody. In Jar as a village, Avar is not endangered. It's level 5. But Avar is not only spoken in Jar. You go, for example, to Dagestan. If you go to Dagestan, you go to Makhachkala is the capital. The children there, they don't speak Avar, even though their parents do. So Avar and Makhachkala can be endangered without it being endangered in Jar.
So here's the question. Does it make sense to come up with some local language as a human population?
For the human population, it would not make much sense, no. We do talk, again, about these kind of, there is a global threat to linguistic diversity that is very real. Multiple languages, we would call them, it's called language death. Languages do die, and they die when their speakers stop using them. Or in the case of sign languages, it happens sometimes when you stop signing. And multiple languages die every month. Again, imagine most languages are spoken by around 3,000 people. It's not hard for most of them to, over time, disappear. You have economic pressures, people leave the village, they go find work, they drive Uber, whatever, in Baku, in Moscow, in San Diego. They stop speaking with their parents in their language, it goes away. It's very common. So at a global level, even though there is this trend, we do not assess these globally. We assess these locally. Does that make sense? And then you have the next level. This is critically endangered. This is when the language is, we can pretty much predict it's going to go away. It's used by just a few of the great grandparents. Among the older generation, maybe not all the grandparents even speak it. So that is when those people whose parents stop speaking it, that's when they grow up. And then it goes away. And then finally, we have language extinction, language death. Yeah.
The classification could be not just locally, but could be probably community-based as well.
Yes, that is the intent. The intent is community-based, and there are communities that are across borders. So Avar, I mentioned Avar earlier, that's across borders. Azerbaijani is a little bit interesting because you have official status in the Republic and non-official status in Iran. So it's a bit difficult to talk about in terms of one kind of assessment. The assessments are going to be different. But for Avar, like, so Avar has a literary history of being an official language in Russia, in Dagestan, but it is not really official now. It's not used for most education. And so you can talk about Avar as being a kind of transnational community in a way that's different from how Azerbaijani is transnational. In San Diego, we have a native community, indigenous group called Kumeyaay. They are the indigenous Native Americans. There's a few thousand of them, and they are split on the border between Tijuana and San Diego. And so that is a community that actually shares one kind of community structure because they marry each other across the border. And so that community is preserved. But they're losing speakers. So the assessment of Kumeyaay as a language, that it happens across the border, but it's still kind of local because it's one group. Yeah.
I'm curious, is there some kind of initiative language preservation? You know,
We're going to talk about that.
Extrapolate.
So language, okay. We're going to talk about that. Large language models, I will comment on that though. It's very difficult to use them for preservation because they themselves are in a certain way dependent on having a large data set. You need corpora. So this work I was doing earlier with Azerbaijani literary history, I built the corpora. And these token counts, that's how many words are in the literary publication. So this is an Azerbaijani corpus that I built, but it is still, I mean, even though it has thousands of words, and in the modern corpus we use newspapers that has roughly 1 billion words, it's too small for a large language model. Yeah.
What about, like, maybe this stretches the topic and I'm happy to take it.
Sure.
But I'm curious, what about synthetic?
Right. So there you would need an understanding of how the language works grammatically, and that's what we do. That's what linguists do. So yes, that's good. You could try to work with that. That's actually part of what my dissertation does. So I'm happy to talk about that another time. Yeah. But you do need grammatical description to have that kind of baseline. So that's intergenerational criteria. I think for some of you, this is probably very personal. You probably have your own stories about how you use the language with your relatives. So it's worth thinking about, you know, where might your family fall here? We also have other criteria, though. It's not the only one. We have also proportional criteria. This is kind of just measuring the size of the community. How big is it? And also, well, how big is the language within the community? So for example, you can identify as an Azerbaijani or a Turk or Turkey, whatever you might want to call yourself, without speaking the language, right? If everybody who identifies that way speaks the language, we call it safe. It's a safe language. Again, Jar is a small community, only around 3,000 people, 2,000 people actually, but everyone pretty much speaks Avar. So in Jar, Avar is a safe language. If nearly everybody speaks it, like roughly around 80, 90%, we would say it's unsafe, actually. Most of the people speaking it is not enough for us to consider it not endangered. Everybody has to speak it. If a majority speak it, it's endangered. So 50%, half the community speaks it, we would say that's endangered. I hope you understand the reason for that. It's because in order for a language to die, there has to be another language. You have to have some kind of bilingualism. I'm not saying bilingualism is bad. I'm going to say the opposite, actually. But if the community is not careful, bilingualism is the prerequisite for the language dying. And then if a minority speak it, it's severely endangered. If very few people speak the language, it's critically endangered. And then you have language extinction. Now, we have a concept in linguistics of domain. It's a different domain when I talk to you at school versus when I talk to you here versus when I talk to you at McDonald's. All of those are different domains because they have different social conventions that we're going to follow, right? You might show more respect to a professor when he's teaching a class than you will show him when he is, I don't know, at a park with his family, for example. So if we have a new domain, for example, TikTok. TikTok is a new domain. It did not exist 6 years ago. Nobody was using TikTok, but now it's popular enough to be at the level of national discourse for talking about banning it versus not banning it, whatever. If you're using the language in a new domain like TikTok, it's healthy, that's good. So you actually want, as a community generally, the language to be used in these new areas. That's a good sign of language health. If the language is used in some new domains, but not all of them, we're not too sure how safe it is. So for example, let's say you use it for email, kind of new, but not for TikTok. Well, we would say that's probably a 4 on this scale. It's used in some new domains, but not the newest ones. If it's used in many domains, we're not even talking necessarily about new domains anymore. We're talking about traditional domains now when we get to 3. You use it in education, you use it for daycare, you take your kids to daycare, they speak the language. Lots of people will take their children to like a Spanish class for kindergarten or something in San Diego. That's probably at a level 3. And then we have what we call coping and minimal levels. And this is where the language really starts to lose domains. You could imagine a family, you speak Azerbaijani Turkey, the grandma speaks it everywhere. She speaks it in the kitchen, she speaks it at the market, she speaks it when she replies to you on Facebook or something. But you don't do that. With her, you speak it, but you don't use it on Facebook, for example. We would call that a 1 or a 2. And then 0 is when it's not used again in any domains. So language death. Yeah. Spanish is not really that endangered because it's growing. It's being used. So if we look at these, the number of domains that Spanish is being used in is higher than it used to be. You go, for example, to CVS or Target. It's quite normal to hear the cashier talking with the customer in Spanish. That was not happening 10 years ago. So in Spanish, actually, it's going higher and higher and higher in San Diego. Yeah. Or for example, you take a bus, the bus announcements that announce the stops. It used to be only in English. Now it's in Spanish and English. It's bilingual. So when we talk about these kinds of domains, it's useful to remember that as linguists, we're not trying to say what's right, what's wrong. There's a difference between how we prescribe the norms of the language versus how we describe it as linguists. Language authorities, language groups, language activists, they want to have certain kinds of rules. But sometimes variation, like I told you before, that's quite normal. And we as linguists, we just describe it. So there are groups, for example, like Grammarazi. I don't know if anyone has seen them. It's a North Azerbaijani group that likes to make fun of people who make mistakes when they are writing. So for example, Amerikan, ya Amerikalı olabilir ama Amerikanlı yok. Böyle bir şeyler var. Maslahattir. This is an ad for, I think Clear is like it's a dandruff or a shampoo. It's a Russian shampoo, I think. And so they had this ad in Baku, and it says, güçlendirilmiş formula. Grammarazi responds to it. They says, no, formula yok, formul olsun. They say, yağlığa yok, yağlığa. Böyle bir şey, ha. Yazılmalıdır. Bir de 3 kat yazılmalıdır. How do you guys feel about yağlılığı?
Yeah, that's
Ben özüm deyilirəm ben.
that's the correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ama siz ne dersiniz?
Yeah.
Yağlığa.
Yeah, that's a look. There is no right. It's wrong.
Yes, that's what it's saying. It's saying yağlılığa olmalıdır.
Yes.
Ha. Ama siz ne dersiniz?
Yeah.
Siz böyle düzgün dersiniz. Ha. Okay. Amerikanlı olsa, Amerikanlı eşitsəsiniz məsələn. Düzgün səslənir, yoxsa səslənir? Düzgün, yox, söhbət oradan getmir. Ben düzgün olup olmadığını soruşmadım.
Çox istifadə olunur. Kütlənin axı istifadə elədiyinə istifadə edə bilmərsən, sən ana dilinin grammatik şey.
Yox, amma nəyə görə soruşdum? Soruşdum çünki əgər bu səhvləri göstərmək istəyirlərsə, o deməkdir ki, belə danışanlar var.
Bəli.
Əgər belə, heç kim belə səhv etməsədir, göstərməzlər.
Bəli.
So, kimsə Amerikanlı deyil. Mən bilmirəm kim deyir, amma kimsə deyir. Siz sən deyirsən. Mən də. Ha.
Meksikalı ama ya Meksikan olmalı ya Meksikalı olmalı.
Meksikanlı.
Yeah.
Okay. Mən əslində Azərbaycan dilini öyrənməyə başlayanda bu həmişə məni çaşdırdı. Amerikan düzdür, yoxsa Amerikalı? Bəlkə 5-6 ildən sonra öyrəndim, hər ikisi gedir.
Bilirsiniz, üzr istəyirəm. Bilirsiniz, o sosial qıdan barədə bizim də az dilimizi daşıyanların sayı, əlbəttə ki, o geniş prestij dillər sayılanlardan çox azdır. Adam da istəyir ki, dil varsa, heç olmasa qrammatik düzgün danışılsın. Çox qəribədir ki, sosial mühit də, o qınaq da çox rol oynayır. Misal üçün, siz rus dilində, biz rus dilliyi deyələ, rus dilli yox, rus təhsilimiz var deyələ, mən bu dildə rahat danışa biləm. Əgər sən sosial mediada olsa belə, fikrini rus dilində bildirirsənsə, avtomatik ruslar sənə səhvi düzəlt deyir. Yəni, mənim dilimdə belə səhv danışa bilmərsən və yaxud da səni ignor edirlər, sənə cavab vermirlər, düzəliş edir. Amma bizim dildə deməli, çıxışlıq hal və yerlik halın dasını bağlayıcı da ilə səhv salırlar və insanlar bunu elə-belə adam etmir, sıradan adam etmir. Alim edir, həkim edir, müəllim edir. Artıq başlayıb Azərbaycanda da səhvələrdə bu cürə səhvlər edən insanlara, kidən sonra vergi qoymayan, bağlayıcılıq ismin hal şəkilçilərini ayıranlara avtomatik ziyalı insanlar tərəflər yansır edilir. Bu mənim xoşuma gəlir.
Sadəcə, mən cavab vermək istəyirəm, amma siz də... Yox, buyurun, çünki mən burada çox qalmaq istəmirəm, ona görə.
Çoxluğun danışdığı hələ düzgün demək deyil, onu demək istəmirəm. Mən var o cürə danışdım. Yazılış, Azərbaycan...
Razıyam sizinlə.
Yazılış fərqlidir, danışılıq fərqlidir. Bizdə Azərbaycanda...
Təbii ki, mütləq. Belə bir fərqlər olmalıdır, təbii ki. Buyurun.
Being from a community that we are actually, I believe that we are more sensitive to the Azerbaijani and then for the North Azerbaijan because we have it and we were fighting for it. But the thing is that sometimes when we have as a language activist, we turn too rigid, and then that is a fight that you're gonna lose. Right?
I agree with you.
Language is gonna push you to, it's just you're gonna fight for your kids, the generation. Don't do this, and they're gonna do it. And
I appreciate you for making this point. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite likely that I would say Amerikanlı.
Amerikanlı.
I would think it's correct. Also formula from the
Ayıb olmasın, mən də belə deyirəm.
But like, I'm just asking myself why. I think it comes from my imperfect or incomplete knowledge of Azerbaijani grammar. But I generalize from a small subset of Azerbaijani that I'm pretty sure I know. And I would say Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan is a country which ends with that. And that's why thinking Azerbaijan, I would also say American.
But now you are, okay,
Would be American.
now you're being very self-conscious and you're correcting yourself based on how you would say Azerbaijani. Like, this is a typical kind of self-correction that everybody does. It's normal, but it's not necessarily reflective of how the language is actually used. I'm not saying that the way you say Amerikanlı is necessarily wrong. Maybe Grammarazi says it is, okay. But I think there are quite a few people who maybe even use the language more than you who will say it that way as well. I don't think it's unusual. Thank you. Sen de diyecektin.
sualı varsa bakmak
I do want to ask, so about time though, how much time do we have? Because it is now 3:15.
We are so lucky to have you here, so we have time.
Okay, well, I don't want to take too much of your time, so I do want to move forward, but I want to address the point in the back that was brought up about rigidity of the community, because you find these attitudes of rigidity versus acceptance in every community, and it's quite normal. To return to the point earlier about domains, though, I want you to keep this in mind. What does it mean to have a new domain? The internet for all languages is a new domain because the internet is new. It did not exist 50 years ago. So when we talk about new domains, we can look at the internet. We can look, for example, at YouTube. You can find, for example, songs like this. This is a kind of musically mechana that I quite like, but the people who listen to this music are not always the most well-spoken, perhaps. You guys know who Vahid Gadim is? Ah. Of course, there's lots of words from Russian that he's going to be using. Ruchnoy. So this kind of style of speaking is a very colloquial style. I don't know, for those of you who identify as Southern Azerbaijani, how much do you understand when he's speaking?
Like one word.
And those of you who are maybe from Northern Azerbaijan, how much do you understand? Yeah. Yani o çok lor dilde danışıyor, yani okuyor.
O əruz vəznindən istifadə edir. Onun dərviş üslubu əruz vəzni üzərindədir. Əruz vəznində bizə farsdan keçmədi. O baxımdan, məsələn, belə deyərdim ki, sırf məişət üslubunda böyümüş insanların çoxunu başa düşməyə bilər. Amma əgər sənin əruzdan, şeiriyyatdan xəbərin varsa, sən yüz var.
Məncə, əgər adam özü Bakıdan gəlsə, məsələn, məhz özü kişi olsa, çünki məhz kişilər belə danışır, məncə hər şey başa düşər. Amma onun dili, I'll switch to English, his way of speaking is a very colloquial style. It's a very kind of, you would say it's street language, casual language, lots of Russian mixed in. And from the perspective of rigidity versus flexibility, this is incorrect. It's wrong. It's not really what Azerbaijani should sound like. It's okay to have those opinions, but I want to point out the comments also. This kind of video encourages people to use Azerbaijani online. Everyone's watching the video, they're all commenting in Azerbaijani. The Azerbaijani, I think, has lots of mistakes. This guy says, bu manını ilk dəfə 8-ci ildə maşında eşitmişəm. Orada eşitmişəm yazır. Eşit olmalıdır. T-lə gedir. Amma burada D-lə yazdı və səhv sayılar. Bir də bu adam Azərbaycan hərflərindən istifadə etmək istəmir güya. Hələ də yazır, amma hələ də olmalıdır təbii ki. But again, keep in mind that notion of rigidity, flexibility. Even when this person is writing with the wrong letters, they are still using the language in a way that I think everybody understands. And very often for smaller languages that are not so standardized as Azerbaijani, this is how all communication takes place. It takes place with these non-standard forms of writing. This is not necessarily a bad thing. From the perspective of a linguist, actually, for the health of the language, this shows the language is healthy. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So I'm curious, instead of treating this as a holy word, saying everybody speaking as
It's not a holy word, certainly.
I will elaborate. So instead of thinking like everybody to be something, that everybody speaking as a speaking in a certain correct, pristine way, would it be more like, would it take a pressure away to create integrity? Like, you know, like in big languages like English, British English, there is this BBC English or Queen's English kind of thing. And everybody's pretty calm that, yes, this is one English, but there are many others.
Yes, we have multiple standards. Yeah.
In Germany, there is Hochdeutsch, and there are many versions of German. And nobody tries to kind of fool in one way. Would it, like linguistically, is this a natural development of language?
Yes, having multiple standards is natural. It's quite common actually for many languages. Sometimes politics get involved and they drag languages apart. For example, if you go to the Balkans, you speak in Serbian in one country, you go to the next country, you say the same thing, and they say now you're speaking Croatian. That's politics. Yes, it happens, but multiple standards are quite normal, really. So from the perspective of just language health, language endangerment, this is healthy. So think about what that looks like for you when you want to use your language. What do you think healthy looks like? You want to be using it in new domains, right? So this is kind of a model for how that looks like. So an example of what not healthy looks like, there's a stray English comment saying nice Indian song. Thank you, Wahid Bhai. Do you know what bhai means? Bhai is like gagash in Hindi. Similar to Bey, actually, Wahid Bey, but yeah. So this is an example of what not healthy would look like for Azerbaijani. You don't want necessarily stray languages coming in, even if they are English or Russian or other some widely understood language. You want to be using the language of the community. Okay. Now, another category, another criteria that we use is language protection. How protected by official organs is the language? If all languages are protected, we would categorize that as a 5. This is technically the case in America. In the United States, if you go to court, you are technically by law required to have access to all of the court proceedings in your language. You are supposed to have the right of an interpreter, for example. You get a parking ticket, you go to court, you're supposed to be able to dispute that parking ticket in Azerbaijani. So that would be 5th level. In practice, this doesn't always happen. There's actually a lot of cases, even in the US, where you go to court and we can't find an interpreter for Avar or Mishtek or Zapotec or some other small language, and this ideal doesn't get upheld. So this is actually very hard to do in practice. Very often, though, countries will be at level 4. They will have a different level of support for different languages. The minority languages are protected in some way. This is actually the level that America usually comes out with, is this 4th level of protection for minority languages. In the 3rd degree of protection, we have no explicit real policy, but we have no discrimination either. Minority languages can be used, but it's expected to use the prestigious language in public. And then in active assimilation category, level 2, the government encourages assimilation to the dominant language. This happens somewhere in America as well. And in American history, it was quite common, actually. You would, for example, have children speaking one language and the teacher would beat them with like a stick or a ruler. Don't speak that language, you will slap you on the hand. It happened, for example, for my grandparents. They had to go through that. They got, their hand slapped. So this is an active assimilation policy. And then in forced assimilation, non-dominant languages, the minority languages, tend to be actively dissuaded. That's when you get arrests happening, you get political disputes, you get some kind of, sometimes violence even, and that's a very uncomfortable level to be at. And then finally at 0, you have the banning of the languages. The languages are not allowed to be used. It's illegal to use them. Yeah.
Where would you put Iran in?
Well, that's what you would know more than me, actually, because my expertise is not in Iran. I've worked a little with Iranian communities. I work with Qashqai speakers, for example, but I've not worked a lot with Azerbaijani speakers. So you tell me.
Active between 1 and 2.
Well, they started bottom to top. And the problem is that the Azerbaijani community, they were just not that. So it doesn't mean that they didn't want to inhibit. they did it. That he didn't like you have to speak Farsi in school at least. It wasn't there, and then it became impossible. Especially that population is so high. It just gradually is coming up, but definitely never gonna get in 5. But it is like maybe like in the 3-ish. But it again not because of lack of effort. It just didn't work.
I think that's probably likely. You guys are right that 2 or 1 might fit the situation in Iran. I think, for example, if you're in Tabriz, you speak in Azerbaijani, I don't think anyone is going to think it's weird for you to speak it, but let's say you go to a court, you're probably never going to speak in Azerbaijani in that area. You might.
But the documentation is not
Okay, documentation will not be there. Okay. Yeah.
So that is a problem because when in the court, your documentation is not a language, and then
I would think that that current situation that you're describing would fit this level, probably the 2. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like it's probably that. You can't defend yourself in the language. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. So I think there is probably an active policy of assimilation. Yeah.
Then in Southern in Iran, quite frankly, or that in Iran, depending on city and depending on how officials are driving it. Okay. In rural area, for instance, in Meshkishar or Germi, everybody speaks Azeri, even at court, the judge is Azeri. So everything is written in Persian. Well, everybody understands.
Right.
Of course, there's a lawyer, supposedly, that could facilitate the process. However, if you go to rural area in Kashmir, the situation is quite reverse. So it depends, as I said, it's more locality than generality.
Yeah. Yeah, it has to be local. It has to be local because if it's not local, you gloss over so many of how these things occur in practice. Yeah.
and again, it was not because of lack of they tried. They tried something.
Yeah.
Interesting. As you can see among ourselves, we have different perspectives about where Turks in Iran, Southern Azerbaijan. So then like it all depends on how is that assimilation, right? Because the bigger cities are where the populations majority are residing.
Precisely.
And there, as I think the gentleman, I'm so sorry, but it's in bigger cities. Actually, there was a case that a woman, she was an Azerbaijani woman, she couldn't defend herself in the court to say that she was innocent in whatever
She couldn't speak Farsi.
That exact same thing happens here. So oftentimes you can want a higher level of protection, but it won't always happen in practice. And usually whatever you want is usually actually 1 level higher than what actually happens, right? So in America, we want 5, but we get 4. In Iran, they might want 3 or 2, but they get 2 or 1, right?
Because people are moving to big cities and slowly the assimilation is taking over.
That is everywhere, yeah. And so the point that sorry, Niyaz? Sen Niyazsan. Ulduz. The point that you brought up, Ulduz, is actually happening everywhere, this kind of economic pressure. You know, if you are from, do people know who the Amish community are? If you're an Amish speaker from Pennsylvania, you're not going to stay in your Amish community necessarily. Many Amish people, they speak a different language. Amish Pennsylvania Dutch is what we call it. They move to New York, they speak English, and they lose their language. It happens sometimes. In Baku, it happens. You have people move from the villages. Maybe their family is from Zagatala or Lankaran or something. They move to Baku. They start speaking only Azerbaijani or Russian. They lose their language. This is an economic pressure to move to cities. It's a result of industrialization, and it's happening everywhere in the world.
I think the issue is that the population, the number of people.
Yes.
Turks in Iran is actually pretty high.
Yes.
Right, and then that assimilation is just erasing.
Yeah. Iran is, again, if you go back to the map I showed you earlier, Iran is one of the most linguistically diverse places in the world in terms of countries, there is a mass loss of language happening there. Yeah.
Like in 20 years, there's gonna be more extinction of languages and there's gonna be like one universal language.
First part of the question, yes. Second part of the question, no. And I can talk a little bit about why, but I want to keep moving on for a little bit. I'll come back to that. So that's one thing. This is actually, I think, the most important one. It's the community attitude. It's how people from the community view themselves. From my perspective as a linguist, I really think this is the most important one. Because you very often come across community members who don't really care too much about their own identity, which they're free to do. But if they don't care about learning the language and they have no will, then it over time is going to disappear. There's really no question about that, to be honest. Yeah. It can be your familial affiliation, your relationship to your mother or your father. It can be your participation in events. For example, maybe someone is an ethnic Azerbaijani, they move abroad to a different speaking community in San Diego or San Jose, whatever. You are now a part of an English speaking community. You're part of the English speaking group, but you're also a part of an Azerbaijani speaking group. Your affiliation with one group does not exclude you from another group. So, for example, someone from, again, Lankaran can go to Baku. They are part of two communities. They're part of a Talish speaking community, maybe, and also part of an Azerbaijani speaking or a Russian speaking community as well.
This classification, I will always be.
Yes, yes, yes. It doesn't change even when you stop using the language, because the speech community doesn't depend on using the speech. It's about your affiliation to other people. That's why it's a community. So if everybody's using it, okay, good, we're safe. If most people are using it, or most people support using it even, maybe they don't even use it, but they support using it, then that's a 4. Let's say in this room, 80% of you support using Azerbaijani, that would be at a 4, even if you don't speak it. If many members support it, but some people are kind of just, like I don't really care that much, that would be a 3. And then we have only some people doing it. There are communities, for example, of language users where you have like some people who are really invested in preserving the way their grandma spoke or their grandfather spoke. They are the poets, the writers, the teachers, they really care. But everybody else, maybe they don't care so much. Well, that would be a 2. And then if only a few people support it, but most people just don't care, this is what happened in Ireland, actually. In Ireland, we are about a 1 or a 2. Most people in Ireland, yes, there was historical oppression, there was, colonialism from the English. It's gone now. We don't have it anymore. We're free. But most people just don't care enough to use the language. We're not going to learn Irish and use it when we go out to the bar or to the club or on Facebook or on TikTok, whatever. We're just not going to use Irish. And so it's at a 1 or a 2. And then if nobody cares, then the language, again, it goes away, right? You obviously can't preserve a language if nobody wants to use it. It's going to be like, Latin, or even better than Latin, because Latin is still used in the Vatican, at least. So your attitudes matter. And, you'll see comments like this. Why do I need to learn Azerbaijani? I speak English, I don't really use Azerbaijani at work. I got asked, like, why am I learning Azerbaijani when I went to Baku? People are like, Azerbaycan dili sana ne için lazımdır? Yani niye öğrenirsen onu? Yani faydasız değildir. Get Rus dili öğren. So, like, people will ask me that, or even Spanish in America. Like, when I was a kid, when I was in school, I thought, why do I need to learn Spanish? I wanted to learn Italian. I didn't want to learn Spanish. I think, everybody who comes from Mexico, they learn English. Why do I have to learn Spanish? Now I live in San Diego, and if you want to go on a date with some of the pretty women, they all speak Spanish. So you have to learn Spanish, right? It's not really a choice. You need it. But so the community attitudes matter. And that's both for people who have family in the community and people who join the community later. The attitudes matter. They're important. There is actually evidence that we have scientifically for multilingual advantage. Your working memory tends to be better when you're multilingual. Now, I'm not saying it's free. It's not free. When you grow up multilingual, you do tend to learn slower, technically slower, because you're learning more words than the other people. right? I have to learn how to say bottle and butulka, for example, if I want to look at this, if I'm speaking Russian and English. But if I'm just speaking English, I can just say bottle, and that's one word, and it's learned faster. But the kids who are learning two languages over time, they will catch up. You know, when you get to 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade, the kid is a teenager, they catch up to the monolinguals in terms of the vocabulary. And their working memory ends up being better. They remember everything better. Mathematics, what they read yesterday, some kind of random fact about history. The working memory short term tends to be better because there's more things to access it. I can remember bottle, butulka. That's two things to remember a bottle. Yeah.
You're saying when a kid learns to,
Yes.
but is it slower per language? Or is it just
Well, it's both. I mean,
compared with if a kid learns Azerbaijani and Russian, and will the kid learning, like, you know, if I divide the time by 3, will it be the same time as if the kid was learning only Azerbaijani?
no. You will start speaking in sentences, for example. Like the baby, when the baby is growing up, we say they have babbling, they go blah, blah, blah, blah, blah. They make noises. They start saying words like cat, dog, one word. There's a one-word phase. That one-word phase for the bilingual kid will last a little bit longer, a few months longer. And then they have the two-word stage. Daddy, come, for example. Mom, hi. You know, these kinds of things, greetings, salutations. That's the two-word phase. It will last longer for the bilinguals than it will for monolinguals. But again, we have trade-offs later in life that show that it's probably a good thing. Again, also communication strategies across all domains of life tend to be better for bilinguals than it is for monolinguals. So there is a trade-off, but it tends to be worth it for most people. And also for later in life, if you get dementia, Alzheimer's, we have good evidence that bilinguals are better at getting rid of those symptoms for longer than monolinguals are. So again, don't ever think that just because there is a deficit in early learning for children that it's bad. It's not bad. It's usually pretty good. And then finally, we have documentation as the criteria for language endangerment. How documented is the language? This is really where the linguists have to do work and not just the community. It's where people like me have to write things, because how much we write things, how much we describe things, that helps everybody with, for example, dictionaries, that comes from the linguists. The large language models like ChatGPT, that comes from the linguists. So we have to do some documentation work. If there's good documentation, there's dictionaries, there's textbooks, there's grammar books, that's a 5. I would say in Azerbaijan, Azerbaijani is a 5. It's pretty well documented as a language. If you're at level 4, there maybe is like one linguist somewhere in 1965 who wrote a really good grammar, and then everybody after him has not been that good, and there's just not a lot of books. Maybe there's one dictionary. Okay, it's at a 4. We have some understanding of the language. Maybe people speak it very, very well and very fluently, but we don't really know everything about how they would talk in certain scenarios, you know? Maybe I really understand how I can say negation, getmedim, gelmedim, düşünmedim, but I don't understand like how the future past works. Gelecektim, diyecektim. So that would be a 4. At 3, maybe there's some decent grammars, but they just don't cover everything we need. Maybe even negation won't be covered. Sometimes it depends on the grammar writer. And then in 2, there's grammatical sketches. Some languages in Iran and in Azerbaijan also, they are at 2 for some of them, because they are spoken in only a few villages and not a lot of people have worked with these communities. A lot of the Turkic varieties in Iran, for example, some of them are at 2. Like, for example, Khorasani Turki. It's a little bit different from Azerbaijani Turki, and we don't have lots of good descriptions of Khorasani Turki, for example. And then inadequate, it's really just we have like some words maybe. That's the best we know. Nothing. And then, of course, if there's 0, then the language is unknown. We don't know about it, right? So to wrap things up, I just want to talk about endangerment in Azerbaijan and here. I'm not going to talk too much about endangered languages in Azerbaijan because I think for most of this room, we don't really use them too much. I just want to draw your attention to the Journal of Endangered Languages. It's a it's a journal published in Turkey. And there was a recent issue of this journal that focused on languages of Azerbaijan, including a bit of it from how Azerbaijani is used by these communities, which is kind of important. I published about Lezgin in this journal. If any of you know where Gabala is, it's in northern Azerbaijan. So I work with some of the Lezgin community there. So that's there if you are curious about it. But for America, I want to talk about what it means for people here, what it means for us to be heritage speakers of languages, and what it means for languages to be endangered in America. Not all linguists agree what the native speaker is. You can say, I'm a native speaker of English, I'm a native speaker of Azerbaijani, Turkish, Russian, whatever. It means different things to different people. Sometimes it means you know the grammar well. It means that when you speak, like you just know it automatically. It comes to you very easily. Okay, you're a native speaker. For other people, it means you grew up using the language at home. Maybe you don't even know the grammar that well, but you grew up using it at home, and so you're a native speaker. Or maybe you were educated in the language monolingually. Maybe you didn't use the language at home. Maybe you are, I don't know, you're like a Spanish-speaking family, but you moved to America, and now you're American. You don't really use English at home ever, but you were educated in English at school, and it was the only language that you learned mathematics in. So you're an English native speaker, even though your family is a Hispanic family. Then there's heritage speakers. Heritage speakers are the speakers who speak that language who only partially fit those rules for native speakers that I told you just now. If you, for example, are from that Hispanic family, you might be a heritage speaker of Spanish because maybe you used it at home, but you didn't really know the grammar that well and you didn't get educated in it. You're not a native speaker of Spanish. You don't feel like one, but you're a heritage speaker because your family speaks Spanish. So that's what we mean when we say heritage speaker. Most immigrant families in America end up being heritage speaker families. It's quite normal, actually. I don't know if anyone has heard of the 3-generation rule. It happens to pretty much every immigrant group that we can think of. Whenever a speech community immigrates to a new environment, there's a change in prestige, right? Persian can be prestigious in Iran, but it's not prestigious in California necessarily, unless you're going to a Persian restaurant. And so because there is that shift in prestige, there's a change in how Persian relates to the languages that are in California, right? That leads to a shift over generations. Usually it takes 3 generations, grandma, then parents, and then you, grandma, grandpa. Heritage speakers tend to be those speakers that are in the 2nd or 3rd or 4th, 5th, whatever generation. They tend to have a lower degree of knowledge than the immigrant generation. The immigrant generation is generation 1, and then generation 2, they maybe don't use the language, but they can understand it when their parent speaks it with them. Generation 3, they maybe just know bits and words. And that's why it takes 3 generations to lose the language. It's 3 generations for language shift. So the question earlier about language maintenance that came up, how do you maintain it? I mean, there are ways to maintain it. Not to be too controversial, but actually Armenians are a good model of language maintenance in California. Do you know why? It's because they always have these scholarships. They send people off to Yerevan and they say, go study Armenian, go, use the language. They even have their own Institute of Armenian Studies at Dornislife. They're not the only model. Jews actually are a good model for Hebrew. There's things like Birthright that send Jews to Israel to use the language. There's also things that encourage the language use in religious contexts. So Armenians, for example, very often organize around a community church. Jews will organize around a community synagogue. And these tend to be more traditional or conservative environments where the language use is encouraged. And for the health of the language, they tend to be kind of a good thing. Yeah.
but then how do they continue to use it when they're?
Yeah, so that's a good question, right? If they have that church or the synagogue or religious context, whatever, it doesn't have to be religious. It can be any kind of community organization like this even, where people get together and use the language. That provides a social kind of framework for those people who go abroad, who go back to the home community, to then come back and use it, right? It's very hard to do that if you don't have that structure. It's really hard.
Like, do they enforce it? Like, what do they, because I think your talk has been so amazing, because I think about us with our Azerbaijani friends, for example, when we get together, we speak English sometimes.
Don't do that. I mean, you can, of course, you can do that, but you know, it's good to find ways to really use the language when you can. Yeah. Like I showed earlier the thing with Vahid Kadim, because yeah, it's kind of funny, but it's also, I mean, the people who are writing even though they make mistakes. Very often with heritage speakers, a big problem is being a bit ashamed, right? Like that's why I said, like it's okay to make mistakes, because sometimes those mistakes aren't mistakes, first of all. Sometimes it's just a different way of speaking. But even when they are mistakes, it should not be something that prevents somebody from using the language if your concern is passing the language on, right?
So I just wanted to clarify one thing. My understanding of what you said about Jews going to a synagogue, they speak Hebrew.
Yeah.
Is it in formal gathering?
Okay, wait. Actually, this gives me a comment I can bring. Because earlier I said, what language do you guys think I speak? I said, you know, my family language was Irish. And then someone said İvrit. Siz dediniz. Aslında İvrit o kadar yaxşı bilmirəm. So I don't speak Hebrew that well because my family language was not Hebrew. İvrit değildi. It was Yiddish. It's a different language. And the difference between Yiddish and Hebrew has birthright. You can go to Israel, you can use Hebrew. You cannot do that for Yiddish, because Yiddish communities don't do that. So they didn't have that structure. Yiddish is disappearing. It's going away. It's a little bit different now. Like, for example, you asked about where can they use it? I maintain some of my Yiddish because I went to a theater troupe. Like I showed you earlier, Rostram Theater. There's also a Yiddish drama theater that we have in San Diego that I went to. So use the language there, right? So other kinds of community avenues can work as well. Yeah.
Okay. Like from your experience with the schools or initiatives like this,
Yeah.
Are they mostly targeting community members or are they private?
In this case, this is both. The Jewish ones are sometimes both. Usually they're focused more on community members whose family is there. In this case, the Armenian one is too, but sometimes there are scholars who are experts who are not Armenian who will apply for this kind of thing and win it as well. Usually these kind of communities are very small, and so the people who are invested in them are also from them. But not always, it depends.
You think that right?
Well, yes, there is a certain, again, the prestige matters. And so there's a certain kind of effort from some of these groups to make the language more prestigious. And that is something that the community can, to some extent, control. You can try to make a language cooler, hip, whatever, by trying to use it, for example, in new domains, by trying to give some economic incentive like a scholarship. Yes, I mean, these things are real ways to change the perception of the language, yeah. So this is one way that community support can have a real and direct difference on how the language is supported. I do want to point out that, you know, a lot of programs that support the study of languages, they're now going away under the current political climate. You know, we just got cuts to lots of funding. For example, National Sciences Foundation supports lots of work for people who are in America to go to places like Iran or Azerbaijan or Georgia or whatever and work on languages there. That funding is going to be going away because we're cutting DEI, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Part of DEI that includes languages. So that's even more reason for people who know a language to not lose it, right? because the money that we have to try to save those kinds of things, that's going to not always be there, right? It's been there historically. Who knows what's going to happen? Nobody really knows. We had a small lie earlier. The lie was when I showed you that map. On that map, America was very small. It makes it look like America is not diverse. That's not really true. The number of native languages in America is very small now because lots of indigenous groups disappeared over time. But we do have lots of immigrant groups. Actually, we have some of the most diversity per capita on the planet. New York City in particular has that diversity, but California as well. I mean, even in Bay Area, there's lots of plenty diverse communities here. Each of these dots in New York City represents a different speech community. Some of them are in apartment buildings, some of them are on streets, some of them have restaurants. If you go, for example, over here to Kings Highway, there's like 3 Georgian restaurants all on one street. So, you know, we have plenty of good Georgian food in New York if you ever want to come. But the point is that this is a city that we're looking at here of heritage speakers. These 800 different languages, they're not indigenous American languages. They are immigrant languages that come from abroad. So I've done work, for example, with the Endangered Language Alliance. It's a group of linguists based in New York City on 19th Street. Actually, maybe you guys might know. Has anyone here been to 19th Street in New York? There used to be a really good Persian restaurant there. They closed now because of COVID. They closed during COVID. But so on 19th Street, we were based, and, you know, we did documentation work with community members. Does anyone here know of a language called Tat? Tat, yeah. So we work, for example, with Tat speakers in New York City. I had to learn some Tat. I had to like transcribe it. And we take people like Simon, and we work with him to record his story in Tat.
Çünkü mera hürmetli Daniel Kaufman na hürmetli Habib Borcan teklif sıktı ki biyom yekem azun jurimu disagov kuyum. Madem ki seraflara ki yadımero esta ünüt çufara mufteninga çufar mufteninga maksat şeysi yekem زون درین اثر بیافتند و صداش هم باره یکی ما گفت میسخو مستمنای انا عائلی ما شتام جامعه غبز استیگا خورده بردش چو بیریگا صناعت شو پشش چو بیریگا چو پالتر اوکندت کا چو خنوز استد کا هرچی بیر ای فرموز چنقدر دستمداری امبارگاف میگویم که این نوستین برای خیر بوازی نیست.
Okay, I don't want to cut Simon's word off, but it's a 20-minute story, so I'm not going to play the whole thing. You're free to watch it. You can look up Simon's story, Johuri. I don't know if anyone here understands Tat. If you do, that's amazing. This is a specific, it's a Jewish variant of Tat. You go to Guba. I don't know if anyone has been to Guba, but there's a place in Guba called Kırmızı Gasabe. And so it's language from there. The language documentation does not start with the linguist. It has to start with community members. The community members have to want to have their language documented, understood, because if there's not cooperation, then it's not going to happen. It's not going to work, you know? So this was a collaboration between us and Simon. Simon got paid money to come visit our office, and we recorded him with the video camera. Daniel Kaufman and Habib, they did most of that work for the recording. And then we did the transcribing. We wrote down the language. We worked with Simon. We called him, you know, sometimes every week to ask him, okay, bu ne demektir, bu ne demektir? You know, just working for hours and hours and hours to really learn the language and then try to share it. That's kind of the work that needs to happen with the smaller languages, especially for that documentation to happen. Because without that, there's no basis. It has to start with people in the community. So that's the end of the talk. That's all I have to share. I hope this gave some new perspective to some of you. Çok sağ olun.
Teşekkür ederim. Değerli dinleyiciler.
Thought is in the European, yeah. It's related to Farsi. Very close.
Çok sağ olun, teşekkür edirik. Bizim 5 dəqiqə vaxtımız var. Eğer kiminizin sualları varsa çok kısaca suallarını versin. Ve çok istəyərdim ki, elə bir sual eşidim ki, sizin bugün gəlmişsiniz ve eşitmek istediğiniz bir cümle var idi, ama onun müzakirəsi getmiyor. Yəni kısaca istəsəz o barədə də sual verəsiniz. Lakin 5 dəqiqə vaxtımız var.
Okay, I saw your hand first.
Ben iki dəfə olmaq istiyorum.
Ah.
Ben bazı sual olmuş ki, siz bilirsiniz İngiliscə necə your honor deyirsən,
Ha.
məsələn, onu Azərbaycan dilində necə deyir?
Azərbaycan dilində hörmətli nəsə ola bilər ki, hə? Hörmətli xanım, hörmətli bəy.
Bir sualım oldu ki, you didn't talk a lot about the history of Azerbaijan, how it came. I was just
I'm happy to talk about that later. Yeah, for sure.
How was it like for you to learn Azerbaijani?
Difficult. That's something I can share later more, but I went to Azerbaijan many times. I studied at the University of Languages, Diller Üniversitesi'nde okuyordum. And I spent a lot of time on my own. Necə? 4 il yok. 4 illik programı da yok. Sadece xarici tələbələr üçün Azərbaycan dilini okuyordum. And so a lot of time reading and talking with friends. Yeah.
I just want to convey my appreciation for you coming here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
And kudos to you. You are in a very dynamic field.
Yeah.
It's fun.
It's a very dynamic.
Yeah. Join us if you ever have free time. Yeah.
Diyaloglarımızda adi sırayla vətəndaşlarımızın adına sizə, dilimizə göstərdiyiniz saygıya, hörmətə, öyrənmək hissinizə görə təşəkkür edirəm. Siz demişkən, Azərbaycanı vaxtilə seçib, o niyyətlə Azərbaycana getdiyinizə görə sizə təşəkkür edirəm. Bir belə dillər var.
Mən də təşəkkür edirəm. Bu dilinizdir, mənimki deyil. Ona görə mən hörmət göstərim sizə. Siz sağ olun. Okay.
You also know Turkish.
Azmaz.
I wondered learning those, which one was easier classes, Azerbaijan more complicated than Turkish?
I have more Azerbaijani friends. So for me, Azerbaijani is easier. But learning Turkish by itself without, just talking with friends, Turkish is easier. There's less exceptions. Məsələn, Azərbaycan dilində deyə bilərəm, ofisiant məni 34-dür, yəni 34-dür deyə bilər. Və ya məsələn, salam. Mən deyə bilərəm, məsələn, mən bir şey yedizdirdim, belə yedizdirt forması var şimalda. Mən bilmirəm siz nə deyirsiniz. Amma belə yedizdirt sözü məsələn Türk dilində yoxdur. Belə istisnalar yoxdur.
Mən bir daha sual. Əgər siz dilləri sənədlərə bölünürsə, məsələn, Türk dilinin Azərbaycanlı fərqli dildir. Amma Naxçıvanı götürsək və yaxud da ki, Iğdırı götürsək, orada iki boşa yaxın kənd eyni dildən danışır. Amma yəni biz sərhədi necə götürürük? Məsələn, Naxçıvanın hər hansı bir Türkiyə yaxın kəndindəki bir insan, Iğdırda yaşayan bir insanı daha yaxşı başa düşür. Amma siz bayaqlar Türk dilinin Azərbaycanlı fərqlərindən danışdınız. Eyni problemi mən Təbrizdə olarkən yaşadım. Təbrizdə olarkən mən türkləri daha yaxşı anlayıram. Nəinki Təbrizdəki Azərbaycan dilini, mən Azərbaycan dilini. Amma halbuki Azərbaycan dilini nəzərdə tutduqda biz 50 milyon danışdığı bir dili nəzərdə tuturuq. 25 milyon.
Çünki sərt bir sərhəd yoxdur əslində. Mən ona görə əvvəllər deyirdim. Məsələn, Can yazmış, Can yazıb belə şeyləri göstərəndə mən dedim ki, İstanbuldan Təbrizə getsən, belə bir Klein var. Yəni Klein deyəndə belə bir sərt dəyişməsi yoxdur. Sadəcə kəndən kənə dəyişir. Ona görə Azərbaycan dili haqqında danışanda bəzi cəhətlərə baxmaq mümkündür. Məsələn, ıb şəkilçisi var, ıb haqqında danışmaq olar, amma sərt bir sərhəd yoxdur. Ona görə yəni türkoloq olaraq deyirəm bunu.
Onda yeni bir sözü biz deyə bilərik ki, məsələn, Rus dilinin Şərqi Rusiya ilə Qərbi Rusiya ilə Şərqi Ukrayna arasında bir dil fərqi yoxdur. Eyni fərqi biz hiss edə bilmirik Qərbi Ukrayna ilə Şərqi Polşa arasında. Amma Palət dili ilə Rus dili tamamilə birbirindən fərqlənir.
Baxın, mən nə Zaslansky, nə Putin haqqında heç bir şey deməyim, amma deyim, dilə baxanda, belə bir Klein var, yəni Ukrayna dili var, Belarus dili var, Rus dili də var, amma hər üçü deməli bir dil zonasına aiddir. Onlar Polşa dilindən bəzi sərt sərhədləri varsa da, özləri arasında bəzi biraz daha yumşaq vəziyyət var. Yəni öz-özünə yaxınlaşırlar.
Dəqiq bir konsepsiya yoxdur, bölgü necə gedir?
Dəqiq rəsmi variantlar var. Rəsmi olaraq, yəni ədəbi dil olaraq çox böyük sərhədlər var. Amma kəndlərə baxanda, yəni məsələn mən Donbasda yaşayıramsa, ola bilər ki, bəzi sözlər g-la yox, bəlkə g-la deyirəm. O daha Ukrayna dilinə oxşayırsa da, bəlkə Rus dilində danışıram. Yəni bəzi cəhətlərdə o qədər çox böyük fərq yoxdur. Biz deyirik ingilis dilində a dialect cline. Çünki cline nədir? Yəni sadəcə yumşaq sərhədləri.
Çox sağ
Okay.
Təşəkkür edirik. İndi zəhmət olmasa xatirə şəkli çəkmək.
Sağ olun. Siz sağ olun.
Azərbaycan dili haqqında danışmaqda ana dili Azərbaycan dili olmayan xanım da var orada çalışır.